Welcome to Seniority Authority, the podcast where I track down experts to answer your questions on aging. I'm your host, Kathleen Toomey. Let's get smarter about growing older. By now, if you've been listening to Seniority Authority, you should know that in order to increase our health span, not just our lifespan, we need to be active advocates of our own journey. We need to make lifestyle changes as early as we can, pose thoughtful questions to our healthcare providers, and be ready to work on prioritizing our own health. But what if the statistics are stacked against you before you even begin? What if your race, statistically, means you have a higher incidence of disease, depression, or other conditions? This is the focus of our next guest, Dr. Lauren Brown, who's bringing to light some of the challenges of Black Americans in maintaining their health as they age. Dr. Brown is assistant professor and gerontologist at San Diego State University School of Public Health. Her research uses publicly available data to understand the unique differences Black Americans face in maintaining physical and psychological well-being as they age. Taking a bio-psychosocial approach, her goal is to examine the impacts of stress and aging on Black older adults, highlighting common characteristics such as resourcefulness, coping, and agency that they use to reach older adulthood. Dr. Brown also points out the need for increased medical research on non-European people and underscoring the need for genetic data ownership. Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of not-for-profit continuing care retirement communities, where independent, active adults find purpose, community, and peace of mind. Visit us at riverwoodsgroup.org. Now, let's hear from today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks for having me.
When you and I first started our preparation for the podcast, I learned something shocking, that 80% of our genetic database worldwide that are used to understand the role that genes play in health, disease, and the aging process are based solely on European ancestry, despite the fact that today only 16% of the world is of European ancestry. Why is that?
Isn't that wild?
It's crazy.
It's crazy. I think the answer is both simple and complicated. I mean, if you think about the technological advances and just us being able to sequence the genome, that's only happened within the last 50 years. We've been able to sequence the whole genome. The earliest was 2003. And, if you think about the complexity of storing that much data, so DNA is composed of 4 nucleotides, right? This is like basic bio. Back in high school, you learned guanine, thymine, adenine, cytosine, right? These base pairs. And these combination of base pairs can be strung together in a bunch of different patterns that make a really unique code. And each person can be represented by that code. But now that we've sequenced the entire genome, which is about 25,000 genes, which is almost over 3 million base pairs. So one single person's DNA represents a huge amount of data. And we are now storing this information in databases. And so this point that all of the genetic data that we have is primarily housed in European ancestry folks. This to me represents something what I think has been termed as data capitalism, which is this idea that essentially the money to sequence genomes, the technology, the infrastructure, and the power dynamic really exists within the Western world. And so a lot of the benefit and the language and the scientific knowledge is swirling in European communities, not necessarily moving outside of those communities. And then the benefits are also then housed within those communities. The other point that's important to mention here is that science is incredibly insular, right? The scientists in general are often European. Less than 4% of tenure and tenure track faculty in typical research intensive biomedical universities are African American, Latinx, or Native American. So, it may shock you that much of our research is done this way, where a majority of our sample is white and majority of the people who are doing the work are white as well. And so it creates oftentimes this really insular idea about genetics. And then we have a lot of complications that result from having very European data sets.
Well, I know that one of the things we talked about is that the impact of having a white or European baseline when it comes to studying health and aging is that that is posited as the norm instead of being a more representative sample of different populations. So it becomes very isolating to say this is the white European experience, and it's not at all representative of the world.
Exactly. Yeah, I think one of the biggest consequences is essentially that all of our genetic data are less likely to represent the genomes of non-Europeans. And any advances we make in genetic medicine, in pharmacogenetics, at this point, they would primarily benefit European populations because that is who we're studying. As gerontologists, we're typically really interested in understanding the aging process. And we can predict aging with this vast amount of genetic data. We can also incorporate environment and lifestyle and social factors. But as a result, currently, all of the data and information we have, whether it be genetic or whether it be social, is coming from European Americans when we're thinking about this aging process and how we can learn about what this aging process looks like. So we're really getting it wrong for other ancestry groups.
Well, and you introduced me to a term which was new to me called race norming in medicine. Can you explain what that is and how that might impact people?
Absolutely. So race norming comes from a really deep history of eugenics. And I'll explain that. So early eugenicists, they created narratives of biological and genetic inferiority by showing white as the norm and Black people as genetically inferior, biologically inferior. And this really served as a justification for slavery, right? So like if your brain is they're showing that your brain's statistically smaller than white people. As a result, you're 3/5 of a human. You're not worthy of the rights extended to other Americans. And so this race norming, this early history of eugenic statistics has a legacy in health and well-being that still exists today. So you named a few stats when we first started talking about my research, and Black people historically and currently live shorter lives than African Americans in particular live shorter lives than white Americans. They tend to live with more disease and disability. And at the time, they historically blamed Black people for their own health. And it was a genetic and an actual something that we were passing to each other. It was hereditary. At the time, we were not blaming social conditions. We didn't have this language for social determinants of health. We weren't talking about structural racism. We weren't talking about the impact of colonialism and slavery on health and how that impacted the well-being of Black Americans. And now we, of course, have all of this language about social determinants of health. Now we understand how racism, and we're starting to piece together how structural racism is impacting the health and well-being of Black people currently. But this legacy, however, still exists in modern medicine. So clinical science has still kept this idea that Black people are genetically or biologically different in some aspects of how we've measured biology. So let's take, for example, kidney function. So people measure kidney function with something called glomerular filtration rate. And this is a rate that tells you how the kidneys are functioning. Well, there was a race correction introduced in the early 1900s because they assumed that Black people had higher muscle mass than other groups. And this idea of higher muscle mass became essential in knowledge production about kidney function among Black people. And the race correction was actually used in clinical laboratories and medical practices whenever Black people were going to the doctors. And it was a measure to evaluate whether or not they needed transplants. And so by adjusting that or doing a race correction, it made it harder for Black Americans to receive kidney transplants or to receive healthcare services because they have to be at a more severe stage of the disease as a result of this race norming. that then made it harder for Black people to qualify for treatment. This is still happening today. On top of that, the NFL was recently sued for a concussion related settlement for their, I guess, alumni, people who played in the NFL and who are no longer playing anymore. They're retired, and they would actually race norm the Black retirees' cognitive scores, their baseline cognitive scores, assuming that Black people had lower cognition from the beginning. So it would be harder for Black people or Black retirees in the NFL to qualify for the cognitive related help that other white athletes were getting. They were recently sued for this. They settled. So the legacy of this, unfortunately, still exists in so many places today. And you can see and draw that line from the history to current modern medicine. And this is still something we're trying to work against and to teach about as well.
It's unimaginable to me that this is continuing. And I know the history of eugenics and the whole measuring of skulls and all of that. And it just seems like, oh, that was way back when people were crazy. It doesn't feel like that's something that you would ever expect in current modern medicine, but it is still happening. So how do we change that? How do we fight against that?
It's a subject that I think is hard to change because, first of all, the story isn't even out there. Oftentimes, this information is really housed within our medical and science spaces where there are a lot of firewalls. There is one really wonderful Black medical student named Joel Barbell. He is using social media to talk about the way medical school is educating med students and talking about how race norming has been normalized in medical school, talking about how they don't show Black skin or how dermatological problems look on Black skin, showing like Black babies and Black moms having babies, all of these things that are typically very much normalized in white populations, but we don't often teach how they look or what happens in Black populations. Instagram and social media is one really great way that Joelle is attacking it. For me, I mean, I feel like a lot of it is in doing stuff like this podcast. You guys have, this is a great way to communicate and let people know that this is still happening. But how do we end it? I mean, really, that comes down to policy in medicine. And a lot of it has been with researchers examining the history, connecting the dots, and showing how it's still showing up in medicine today and making calls to end race norming in science altogether. And really, we need to be thinking about the other things that actually do predict health. Mm-hmm. Other than race. Race is such a sloppy way to try to get at the risks that somebody might face over their lifetime that may speed up, accelerate their aging, or predispose them to disease. And it's really a proxy or a shortcut to understanding what the real risks are for people and how they live and what their lives are like. So getting that more detailed information about their stress and their lived experience and what their neighborhood is like, how close a pharmacy is to them. Those things are more important in thinking about their health and well-being than somebody's race. And until we get to a point where we're judging people by that.
Absolutely. Do they live in a food desert? What's their access to fresh fruits and vegetables? From your research, and we will put a link to Joelle's Instagram and Facebook accounts in our show notes. So if you would like to learn more about this from someone who's going to medical school and experiencing it right now, you can do that. But from your research, Dr. Brown, what do we definitively know about the aging experiences of non-white older adults? What are their particular challenges? If you are a non-white older adult, what should you be hyper aware of?
Great question. I mean, in general, we know that the social world makes it harder for Black and Brown people to age well. And these particular challenges exist from birth till death. And they can start with childhood adversity and thinking about differences in childhood experiences. There's been a lot of research looking at the quality of education for older adults in their early years and how that changes their dementia risk in later life. So years of education and quality of education are huge predictors of how long you live. Some of the strongest predictors in the United States are also income education, and wealth. So if you can imagine that the largest inequities oftentimes for Black and Brown people exist in income, education, and wealth. And as a result, those three things really chart the differences in how Black people and Brown people are living their lives. But what I think is also really, really important to mention is that we know now, and we are finally able to measure something like racism and discrimination and how that is actually limiting and changing the opportunities that Black and Brown people have to age healthfully. For example, say somebody gets unfairly fired at a job over their lifetime. Now we have data where we can see at which point they were unfairly fired from their job. This is all self-reporting. Obviously, something like racism and discrimination are really hard events to measure or to know that they've happened to you, or to be able to assert, like, yes, I know this happened to me and I know it was discriminatory. But to the best of our ability, we are asking people now about that experience and connecting that to their health and well-being in older adulthood. And all of these points over the life course really matter and lead to what's called accelerated aging that's happening for Black and Brown people, meaning that their actual biological age is older than their chronological age. So they may show up as a 40-year-old person, but their biological aging is much higher. They look like somebody in their 60s or 70s. And chronic conditions are already starting in their 40s and early 40s and 50s instead of 50s and 60s. And so that aging process is just starting a little bit earlier. And if we don't have the data that reflect that, if we don't have people in our data with this unique aging experience, it's harder to understand exactly what's going on or how to change it.
Oh, absolutely. And we were preparing this podcast of the impact of stress, of daily stress. If you are in a situation where every time you walk out the door, you are girding against potential assault, potential discrimination, how that impacts we all know stress is a huge engine of illness in all of us. And that sustained day in and day out stress is going to create some chronic conditions. And we also know that you need to be aware of chronic conditions and start working to prevent them early on. So if you're getting them earlier, it's harder to recognize that, and you have to start even sooner.
Thank you for bringing that up. The chronic stress piece is incredibly important. And it's something that often when you're thinking about health and aging that gets minimized, but it's really an incredibly important predictor of chronic disease and how early you might need to be engaging with healthcare providers as a result of chronic disease. So you're right, it speeds up the whole process and puts people who may not have access to healthcare, who may not have the time to engage with healthcare, in a position to have to engage with healthcare. So yes, it's very important.
And again, you always have to be your own advocate. So you can't let people say, well, that's normal, or that's just you, or you have to really dig in and speak up to your healthcare provider and not accept a subpar solution.
Right. Which is harder to do as somebody who's living in a body that is maybe not of the norm, somebody whose language may not match, someone whose cultural ideologies don't match, or the way they engage with medicine or healthcare is not the same. So the layers are apparent. The layers of how this could happen become really easy to see as you start to peel this back.
If you want to learn more about this, is there a clearinghouse or a place for people to learn more about this race norming and how to protect yourself and advocate for yourself when you are in that situation?
There are some places you can go to find out. I don't think there's a hub. I think you can definitely find now really thoughtful scientific manuscripts that detail the history of race norming across many different outcomes, whether it be lung function, kidney function, diabetes, any of the many biological markers. A lot of them have a history of race norming. There's some information on what's called the LC Hub. It's the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics research. They are actively engaging with some of the ethical issues with the onset of genetics and genomics research in Black and Brown spaces. The comparison to white and norming everything to white people is very much a conversation with the LC Hub. And it's just, instead of just attacking advancements in genetics and genomics, which often most white genetic and genomic spaces do, they will just shoot forward and talk about tech and how we're moving forward into the next generation. And it is up to really a lot of these ethical bodies who are trying to have conversations about the fact that all of this is not equally landing in communities of color. We live in unequal societies. And as a result, the genetic and genomics are landing in unequal ways in our society. And so that conversation is absolutely happening there. There's also some resources on data for Black lives about this concept of data capitalism. And this is not a totally new concept, and it's not specific to genetics and genomics. But if you think about just in general, if a lot of the funding and the science is happening in the Western world and the tech exists in the Western world, they become the creators and owners of knowledge. And even if you were involved in creating that data, they have that data and it becomes their property. And so that imbalance, that power imbalance, is a conversation that people are really starting to have now as well.
For our listeners who are concerned about this, how do you recommend responding in a practical, personal way to inaccurate characterizations in their healthcare visits? And are there particular risks or areas of disease that you would recommend our audience be aware of? Specific medical concerns?
So I'll say that geroscience is particularly vulnerable to pseudoscience. There's the non-clinical and the clinical setting. I think in thinking about the clinical setting, this is where you're going to come across more of the race norming things. So, for example, if you have kidney disease and you're Black, the physician may already put in your race and your biological information that's produced from your kidneys, and will automatically create a score for kidney function as a function of your race. And that's an important conversation to potentially have with your doctor. I have a really great friend who was going through this, and the doctor asked if he was African American and then put that into the program. And he was like, well, what if I wasn't? What if I said I was white? Well, how would that change the whole process? How would that change my access to care? And having those conversations with your physicians, because oftentimes they don't even know what the computers are doing. They don't even understand that when they put in race, that that's part of the algorithm that is predicting your ability to get treatment. And just that conversation can help you guys have genuine conversation about your lived experiences and what you actually need. So that's one place to start. I think the other thing to think about is this consumer to genetic testing, things like 23andMe, where you're paying them for your genetic information, like you want to know your ancestry and health information. So what's important here is, number one, they're making buku bucks in this situation, these genetic testing places, because you're paying them to get your genetic information assayed. Then they're storing your data and then they can sell your data. So most of these companies have huge terms and services payment and conditions pages that allow companies to sell your DNA to third parties for research, for anything, whatever they want to do, for marketing, all of these things. And it's potentially de-identified. They're not going to necessarily come back and find you, although they have done that for certain, like I'm sure you've heard of some of the crimes that have been solved by genetic database. So that's something to be concerned about as well. But in general, they're making a lot of money off of being able to sell your genetic data. You're not the owner of your genetic data. And on top of that, the information you're deriving from this 23andMe, especially about your health risks, most of this is too soon and too early. The likelihood, they'll tell you the likelihood that you're going to get diabetes. These are chronic diseases that are very much determined by lifestyle, that have a lot of potential points of intervention over the life course. It's very hard to predict if somebody's going to get something like diabetes. But a lot of what this is doing is that they are able to group you into a category where they can market diabetes prevention services, right?
Wow.
So now propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a health risk and that you're potentially going to get diabetes. What can we sell you now that's going to keep you from getting diabetes theoretically, even though diabetes is a disease of aging that, may happen to you regardless of your lifestyle factors or entirely because of your lifestyle factors. And all of that is caught up in these algorithms that we don't really have a clean concept. That's really what we're capturing. This would be especially true for non-European populations, by the way. You're definitely going to get less correct answers about your health and well-being and your risks from these types of genetic testing.
It's kind of crazy to think that you don't own your own genetic data. Let's talk about that. And, I'm sure that people that signed up for 23andMe did not read the terms and conditions of the 15-page small space document. If you're getting smarter, let us know. Leave us a review, a rating, wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell your friends and follow us on social. We're at Seniority Authority on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And don't forget, if you're listening to YouTube, hit the notification bell so you can subscribe. Or subscribe to our newsletter at seniorityauthority.org so you don't miss a thing. So why is it important to everyone listening now? Why should you own your genetic data? And if you don't own it, what happens to it?
Great question. So right now, because science owns the technology to sequence your DNA, they fancy themselves the owners. They're the power players. And because they can create the data, they think they own it. But actually, this data cannot be created without you and without your consent. That puts us as individuals in a very powerful position, that the research can only be moved with your genetic information, and you have to consent to giving it to somebody. What owning your genetic data would allow you to do is have autonomy over the governing, the collection, the application of your genetic data. You could sell it to make money. You could sell it for research that would benefit particularly you or the things that your family is dealing with or the things that are a problem in your family. And I think something like this would really enhance the trustworthiness of biosocial and genetics research. I think that's one huge barrier to Black and Brown people even participating in this space, is that how trustworthy is the scientific community in holding this data and, making sure it stays within the realms of what we want it to be used for. At this point, I feel like the history of exploitation in science and the power dynamics in data collection make scientists a very untrustworthy community to engage with, and unfortunately, from an individual perspective. And the data ownership would be one huge way to signal the fact that we're benefit sharing. We want to share the benefits of this, of whatever we create as a result of this. And it shouldn't be just I capitalize or I make money off of scientific data. It's also that we're enhancing community health, and that there are benefit sharing that's coming in the form of money or in the form of health.
And for the ability to decide, I want my genetic material to be used to research this disease or this condition. It's my material, and I want it to be used in certain ways.
Exactly. Yeah, that power to choose, I think, is something that we don't have language for yet. It's not even something that's left. Most of this language and where this is originating from is from indigenous communities who were of primary interest to scientists originally because of their genetic isolation and how unique their genomes were for groups that have stayed really isolated. And now those groups are pushing back in terms of the exploitation that they've experienced, especially the Native American community in the United States. And as a result, they're creating a movement that all of us need to be aware of and all of us need to get on board. They are the canary in the coal mine, and we all need to be paying attention to the abuses that have happened to them and think about how that may happen to the rest of our communities.
And not just think, oh, that's just them. That's not
Right.
going to ever happen to me.
Right. We're next.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we're next.
Mm-hmm.
This is just mind blowing to me. This whole uncovering of what's going on that I haven't really looked closely into. But this is your world. This is your research. What brings you hope when working in this field? What hope can you offer us in this scenario?
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to find, but I will say that there are some really important things that I think are getting me excited. Number one is that federal funding agencies in particular are developing financial incentives for the creation and participation of diverse study cohorts, for diverse people to enter into these genomic studies. And ideally, once Black and Brown people start entering studies, there will be more conversation about how we can better disseminate and benefit share with communities of color in terms of our genetic data. The other thing that I think is really important is this concept of epigenetics. We've been talking about sequencing the whole genome and how important genetics and genomics are. But this idea of epigenetics, which is really a new measure that is based off your genes, but is not genes as destiny, not genes as end all be all, right? There is interaction with stress over the life course in your mom's womb, in earlier generations of your relatives that also are determining your health and well-being. So this integration of genetic and social models of disease and aging, these really have me excited because there's no emphasizing genes over the rest. And I think this is a really important movement to realize that while genes are important, they're not deterministic.
I couldn't agree with you more because everything that we read and hear, it talks about the impact of your life choices and your lifestyle and how you can change your destiny by changing how you live, eat, work, play, deal with stress, your environment. So I think that's very hopeful.
Definitely. And you can put a layer on that in terms of like thinking about what you can change. I mean, we can redesign ourselves socially as a community as well, and thinking about the best ways for our communities to live healthy, long lives. That this is like a goal of a society. And as a societal goal, and we're thinking about predicting how long we can live or try to increase how long we can live. What are the things that we know are good for health and well-being?
That's absolutely true.
Let's do those.
From a city planning perspective, from a social perspective, let's build that into our communities.
Exactly.
What's next for your research, Dr. Brown?
So I am moving into this epigenetic space and thinking about chronic stress, in particular, how it impacts our oldest Black Americans. The president of University of Las Vegas, Nevada, he's the first African-American president, University of Las Vegas, Nevada. His name is Keith Whitfield. He has one of the only data sets of Black twins. So it was historically not popular to study genetics in Black people, especially for Black Americans, particularly because we know that a lot of the models of disease and the things that cause disease are very social in terms of inequity. So the focus was always on social models of disease. And he was really passionate about understanding genes in Black twins. And so he has one of the oldest studies of Black twins. He also has one of the studies of all the longest lived African Americans and their families in the United States.
Wow.
A really great data resource. So I'm using some of his data to do some epigenetic work in that's called the study of longevity and stress in African American families. The whole concept of using this data is that I will be training data from another set of really old Black Americans in the health and retirement study. And so this concept of like always comparing Black people to white people will be eliminated in this space. It will be just a study of Black people where there is not this constant in comparison or this norming. And so it removes everything has to be from the white gaze concept. So I'm really excited about doing some of this work. I think the other thing that I'm really excited about and thinking about is some of this ethical conversation in AI, the way that genetics will be a part of this data reduction strategy in big data, and how all these conversations about AI are coming up, and the integration with genetic data is there's just so much parsimony there, and thinking about some of the human decision making that we need to maintain in this data world.
That's very impressive because AI is an impact on everything. But I love that you are doing this research totally with Black Americans so that you have an isolated, clear set, and it's not comparing to white Americans because it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, what's the relevance?
Yeah, there isn't any. And this could be the start of a whole institute and more of this. And if one research study gets published, gets attention, then maybe this could be reversed because it's time. It's time to reverse this.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
It's past time.
Yep.
So that's been wonderful. I am really appreciative of you taking the time to educate me, to educate the audience about some of these important trends that we need to be aware of. Before I let you go, I have a little fun fast five. We know that you're a very smart woman and really ahead of the curve, but we want to get to know you a little bit better. So tell us what your favorite guilty pleasure is.
Definitely In-N-Out grilled cheese, extra tomato.
Okay.
And regular onion.
Oh, awesome. Well, I wish I lived near an In-N-Out, that's for sure. But I think my body is happy that I don't.
Yes, probably so.
To counteract the In-N-Out burger, what's your favorite healthy practice?
Writing is really journaling, I'll say. Journaling has been something I've done since I was young, and it is a practice that I've kept that I think really helps me think through my emotional well-being. So
that's very smart. What's guaranteed to make you laugh?
The movie White Chicks with the Wayne brothers and my brother. He's hilarious.
That's great. That's great. What's the last book you loved?
I recently read Freshwater by Akaweke Emezi. Of course, I picked somebody with the most beautiful but hardest name. Really cool book. Mm-hmm.
Oh, but it's on my list, but I haven't read it yet. And your favorite escape?
My backyard. My house is my sanctuary. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. It looks like you're there right now.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for sharing what you're doing. And I hope we can perhaps have you back on when you have finished your research to hear about what you've uncovered.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Kathleen. It was really wonderful.
That's our show for today. If you liked it, please tell your friends so we can reach more minds and keep the conversation going. Or follow us on social at Seniority Authority. I'm Kathleen Toomey. Until next time, enjoy your chance to get smarter.